Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Okay, so we now want to welcome today's seminar speaker. He's Professor Ted Davis, and he's in Europe for a number of weeks at the moment over here on sabbatical. He's the Professor of the History of Science at Messiah College in the States in Pennsylvania, and he's also Director of the Central Pennsylvania Forum for Religion and Science. And in his past research, Ted has taken particular interest in the whole 17th century and Robert Boyle and so forth, although his interests, as he may tell us also, have moved on to the 20th century since that time. But today's topic is very much on his earlier research focus, science and religion in the life of Robert Boyle. So thank you very much, Ted.
Until around the year 2000, most of the time I was able to make available for research was devoted actually to Robert Boyle for about a dozen years. I worked with Michael Hunter from Birkbeck College, London, on the edition of Boyle's works and on a number of ancillary projects. But I had never sat down and tried to put together a picture of Robert Boyle's religious life. And I thought it would be appropriate to try to do that, particularly for this audience, but also for the journal Dennis edits Science and Christian Belief. Last October, the full version is printed there, and so if you want to know a little more than I'm going to be telling you here, you can go there to have a look. I'm going to have to turn around from time to time to see what my slides are telling you. I would say that, to start, let me say this. Most people, of course, know Robert Boyle today, if they know him at all, as the person who published Boyle's Law, the inverse relation between pressure and volume of what we now call gases, that is a standard part of a high school chemistry course. Because of his many important discoveries, indeed, we typically think of Boyle, and to borrow an old witticism, as the father of chemistry and the brother of the Earl of Cork. But what's absent from this popular image is an in-depth understanding of the deeply religious man who wrote as much about the nature of God as he did about the nature of air. And having devoted many years of my own life to learning about his, I'm delighted to be invited to share some aspects of Boyle's life and work with you. Let me say that at the start that this is not, in a traditional sense, a scholarly talk, in that I'm not trying to present ideas that are startlingly new or draw on sources previously unstudied. To a very small extent, I did do that in the published version from Science and Christian Belief. But I won't really be doing that here. What I want to do instead is much more modest. I just want to provide a sketch of his religious life, attitudes, and his sense of Christian vocation. I will draw on details of his biography. For the most part, I'm not going to try to nuance those, although they can be nuanced. I should say that there is presently no real biography of Robert Boyle. That situation is going to be remedied in the next several months when Michael Hunter publishes his biography of Boyle. Although it won't be very long, and there will still be many other parts of his life that are not explored in Hunter's biography. It will be the closest thing we have to a comprehensive modern biography of Boyle. Currently, the best biography of Boyle is probably that done by Thomas Birch in the middle of the 18th century. He was the editor of Boyle's works in the 1740s. Here is Michael, and Michael has written in his article on Boyle in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, he has written, "The central fact of Boyle's life from his adolescence onwards was his deep piety, and it is impossible to understand him without doing justice to this." What I really want to do today, then, is to do justice to this and give you a sense of Boyle's piety, the range of it. Now, he was born. Who was Robert Boyle? He was born here. You're seeing a 19th century print of Lismore Castle in Ireland. It's in the southern part of Ireland, a few miles off the coast, not too far from the city of Cork. He was born there in January of 1627. The castle today looks much different than it did when he was there, because most of it was ruined during the Irish portion of the English Civil War in the 1640s. The upper two pictures you see here don't bear any resemblance, so far as we know, to what the castle looked like in Boyle's day. However, the two lower pictures give you some semblance of what life was like there. On the lower left, you see the gatehouse, which was built while Boyle was a boy. And you also see on the right the garden, a view from the garden, the upper garden. The upper garden was designed by the Earl of Cork. So those two pieces of the castle are relatively authentic to Boyle's own time. The rest of it would give you a false impression. Boyle was the 7th son and 14th child of the second wife of the first Earl of Cork, Richard Boyle. His father was an unscrupulous man, though publicly pious, who took advantage of English colonialism in Ireland to become one of the very wealthiest men in all the realm. Perhaps the wealthiest man in Ireland, in fact, at the time, and one of the wealthiest in all the realm. The image on... Sorry about this problem here. I thought I had a different image up there. I thought I had this one. Let's hope that's stable. Okay, the image on the right is actually from a tomb, or memorial, that the Earl of Cork commissioned to honor his second wife, that's Robert's mother, when she passed, when he was only about 4 years old. And this is in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. It's an enormous piece. It's probably 35 feet high altogether. And it's just a representation of the kind of influence that he had and the image he wanted to project of himself in Ireland at the time. But what he was really involved with was power. That's what he was ultimately about. And Robin watched as his older brothers and sisters were married off to the children of other powerful men, the boys given titles and lands, and the girls just the honor of marrying these other wealthy men. Typically, the women's husbands had more ardor for their horses and houses than they did for their wives. Robin's sister, Catherine, Viscountess Ranelagh, whom I will say more about later, married at 15 to a drunken brute, lived apart from her husband for many years before his timely death gave her 2 decades of blessed widowhood. His brother Francis, or Frank, all of 16 years old himself, was torn from his 17-year-old wife Elizabeth, a servant to Queen Henrietta Maria, 4 days after their wedding at the Royal Chapel of Whitehall, and sent with Robin on the grand tour of the continent for 2.5 years. Elizabeth went on to fame as Black Betty, a mistress who bore Charles II a daughter. With examples such as this close at hand, it is little wonder that he took a dim view of courtly mores. The youthful Robin narrowly avoided an arranged marriage himself, and later dodged the well-intended effort of his good friend John Wallis, the famous Oxford mathematician, to match him up with an eligible woman from a wealthy family. Years later, he told a close friend that, quote, he had abstained from purposes of marriage at first out of policy, afterward more philosophically. Now, he held those attitudes from quite an early age. His first published book illustrates this quite well. Now, this was not the first book that Robert Boyle wrote. I'll be talking today about many of his early writings, none of which were published at the time. This was originally written around 1647 to 1648, and but it was published in 1659, the year before his famous book on the air pump. The short title, the running head across the tops of the page, is Seraphic Love, as in angelic love. It turns out that this is actually the last of a series of letters, imaginary letters, literary constructions about love in the form of sort of little romances that Boyle wrote as a youth. And the very last one about seraphic love is the only one that was ever published. Now this particular book is about the superiority of divine love over any form of human love, especially over erotic love. Boyle writes here, he says, "I am no such enemy to matrimony as some are pleased to think me," he said. But then without skipping a breath, he adds, "Yet I have observed so few happy matches, and so many unfortunate ones, and have so rarely seen men love their wives at the rate they did whilst they were their mistresses, that I wonder not that legislators thought it necessary to make marriages indissoluble in order to make them lasting." And he goes on to compare marriage to a lottery, and he notes that in both lotteries, there lie a pretty store of blanks for every prize. And having seen many women try to make the best of bad marriages, Boyle advised the woman who wanted to be a good wife to deliberate upon a choice she can probably make but once, not needlessly venture to embark herself on a sea so infamous for frequent shipwrecks, only because she's offered a fine ship to make the long voyage with. I shan't try to read these as Boyle might have, with whatever his accent may have been, and with the stuttering that he is known to have suffered from. It's not a surprise then that Boyle remained not only unmarried, but celibate his entire life. Now apart from family, to whom I will return shortly, some other important early influences on Robert Boyle have recently been identified. Well, or stressed at least, even though we've known of some of these before. But I find Peter Anstey's claim that Hugo Grotius was influential both directly and indirectly on the early Boyle to be quite persuasive. Specifically, Grotius was a liberal Calvinist in Holland, really a follower of Jacob Arminius. Who wrote about many different topics, but the topic that interested Boyle the most was his book on the truth of the Christian religion, which was intended to be an argument that was broadly Christian in character and would be persuasive particularly to people who were not Christian from cultures that were both within Europe and outside of Europe. People who had already dissented from Christianity within Europe, but also people outside of Europe who might encounter Christianity for the first time. And Boyle had Grotius' translated into Arabic. Boyle paid for that many years after it appeared in 1627. He did this in the 1660s at a time when John Owen and Richard Baxter, two prominent Puritan divines, and Baxter was one of Boyle's friends, incidentally, when those two men were attacking Grotius as a Socinian. That's how they saw him. They found his theology unacceptable. Historically, Boyle's often been seen as Puritan in his tendencies, and I think that's inaccurate. Certainly theologically, he was not a Puritan in his sympathies. He was much more sympathetic with a broad understanding of Christian faith. He thought Socinianism was a heresy, but he did not specifically embrace predestination, and he did not specifically embrace some of the other Puritan attitudes. So he lay somewhere in the middle on these kinds of issues. John Harwood has also done a study, a really interesting study, of an early treatise on ethics that Boyle wrote when he was, again, more or less 20 years old. And he has shown how heavily influenced Robert Boyle was at that time by the Encyclopedia of Johann Allstedt, a leading German theologian. From Allstedt, Harwood argues, Boyle gets a good sense of vocation. He says exactly this much in his book on this early ethical treatise of Boyle's. I will quote from it here. This is Boyle now writing, based upon what he's thinking from Allstedt. He is but a useless, wasteful drone, and an unworthy of the benefits of human society, whose endeavors in some honest particular calling do not some way or other cooperate and contribute to the good of the commonwealth. In other words, you really have to have the public good in mind, or you're a useless drone. While a gentleman is busying himself in any lawful employment that tends to the good of himself, his family, others, or the Commonwealth, he may be favorably thought to be diligent to embrace in his profession. On the contrary, however, but when a gentleman shall spend his whole stock of precious time in carding, dicing, hunting, reveling, seeing of plays, reading of romances, powdering his hair, staring upon looking glasses, courting of ladies that he means not to marry, not to mention what is worse, and in some make vacation his only vocation, he must have a stronger charity than judgment, that believes that God and nature intended only this for man's calling. So you can see from early on, Boyle was impressed with the need to do worthwhile things with his time, but especially to do things that benefited others. He put science in precisely this category, as we shall see, as soon as he became attracted to it. I'll come back to that point. To return, though, however, to his family for a moment. Here is a picture of Catherine Ranelagh. This was his favorite person in the world. She was 12 years older than him and very unhappily married. She lived, as I said earlier, apart from her husband for more than 2 decades. She had her own home in London, and Boyle lived there for much of his life. From the mid-1660s on, really, Boyle lived with his sister in London. But as a young boy, returning from the continent, after his grand tour was over, he lived at first in a home where she was living with one of her in-laws in London at the time during the Civil War. She was a brilliant woman. She convened a salon for important intellectuals, including John Milton, who for a little while served as a tutor to her son, Samuel Hartlib, and several members of Parliament. Her brother, as I say, lived in her London house for much of his adult life. Indeed, he made a laboratory out of part of the space there. She was also deeply pious and well-versed in theology, traits that she shared with their sister, Mary Rich, who unexpectedly became the Countess of Warwick when her husband's elder brother died. Mary experienced a religious conversion in her early 20s, brought on partly by the influence of her sister and her brother. They used to enjoy really what we would call today probably prayer and Bible study together on various occasions. Mary writes about this in her diary. She speaks about having holy discourse together with her brother and Kate, and good and profitable discourse of things wherewith we might edify one another. Now, Robert Boyle's earliest writings date from around his 20th birthday, and they reflect the intensity of his own intimate relationship with God. These include 2 essays on the spiritual damage done by swearing that were published after his death. He was not the least bit hypocritical, however, in writing these. One of the leading churchmen of the time, Bishop Gilbert Burnet, whom you see here on the upper left, recalled many years later, after Boyle's death, that Boyle, quote, had the profoundest veneration for the great God of heaven and earth that I have ever observed in any person. The very name of God was never mentioned by him without a pause and a visible stop in his discourse. Now, a number of his friends comment on that very feature of his personality. So careful was Boyle's adherence to this practice that longtime friends could not ever recall him failing in it. Another important Englishman of the time, Sir Peter Pett, whom you see in the lower image, Peter Pett once asked Boyle about this, about his habit of pausing before uttering the name of God. And what Boyle told him was this: not to have an awe upon us when the name of God is spoken of in company is a sign of want of grace. Now you can see where there is a similarity here toward Puritan attitudes and why a number of Puritans befriended Robert Boyle. But at the same time, he was more open to ideas from non-Puritans than some of his Puritan friends, I think. Around the same time, Boyle wrote an ethical treatise that I've already mentioned to you about it with sense of vocation, and various essays, reflections, and romances on moral and religious subjects. Now, one of those romances on moral and religious subjects, The Martyrdom of Theodora and of Didymus, became in 1750 the basis for Handel's opera Theodora, which I understand has recently been revived in London several years ago, but in the past decade has been revived. Another work that was begun at this time and dedicated to his sister Catherine was Occasional Reflections on Several Subjects. And I'll show you that book in just a moment. But there is a section in this Occasional Reflections on Several Subjects that has, it turns out, influenced hymnody and has subsequently influenced an American composer. So if I may digress a little bit to the United States before it was the United States, during the colonial period, our greatest American composer was William Billings. He's a choral composer. And he wrote the Continental Harmony, a collection of his work in the 1770s. And one of his pieces in there, called Creation, an anthem called Creation, has 2 stanzas, and the second stanza contains this phrase: strains at a harp of 1,000 strings should stay in tune so long. Well, the text is by Isaac Watts. The first stanza is based on one of the Psalms. The second has no known source. Well, it turns out, I'm convinced, the source of this was indeed a passage in Robert Boyle's Occasional Reflections on Several Subjects, where he uses this very metaphor. The fact that Isaac Watts would have been familiar with Boyle's work, this particular work of Boyle's, is not really a surprise to me. This work of Boyle's remained in print up until the early 19th century. So this is, this is nearly 150 years, more than 150 years that this work was in print. And the following passage is typical for its tone and content. We must never venture to wander far from God upon the presumption that death is far enough from us, but rather in the very height of our jollities we should endeavor to remember that they who feast themselves today may themselves prove feasts for the worms tomorrow. Here Boyle expresses, of course, not a morbid interest in death, but the simple recognition that a sense of our mortality is the foundation of morality. Now, Boyle approached the Bible with a similar reverence. And he wrote a treatise on the Bible called Style of the Scriptures. This also was an early work. It was written when he was in his mid-20s, and it was not published until another almost 10 years later. Each morning, he gave a certain amount of time to studying the Bible, despite the poor eyesight that plagued him most of his life. More than this, he developed a very serious interest in biblical scholarship, an interest that was kindled by a youthful conversation he'd had in Florence as part of this grand tour he had, where he spoke with a Jewish refugee from Spanish persecution. His conversation with Jewish scholars over the years is quite interesting. No one's ever really studied this systematically, but it's clear that he's had a number of conversations over the years with rabbis and other Jews who have stimulated him to think in other ways about the Bible and to think Christian beliefs vis-a-vis Jewish beliefs on certain points. Several years after that conversation, his father's very close friend, the great biblical scholar James Ussher, the same man famous today for his calculation of the date of creation, reproached Robert Boyle for being ignorant of Greek. This led him, according to one of his friends, to study and read the New Testament in that language, so much that he could have quoted it as readily in Greek as in English. As his eyesight worsened, he had to give up studying Hebrew, which none of his servants could read, but he was able to get help reading Greek. Nevertheless, he typically took to church a copy of the Bible in the original languages, which he liked to compare with the reading of the chapters assigned for that Sunday, sometimes wondering about the differences in translation. It may therefore come as quite a surprise to learn that Boyle often experienced religious doubt. We read about this in his youthful autobiography. A definitive event occurred in his youth. His youthful autobiography is entitled this. He used the term Philaritus to refer to himself. He completed this probably before he was 21 years old. And it's a story of his adolescent years. And primarily of his travels in Europe. And on one of these travels, they visit the Carthusian Abbey of Grand Chartreuse. And Boyle was very depressed there. I'll show you pictures of that abbey in just a moment. What he described as being located in those wild mountains near Grenoble. There, he said, the devil taking advantage of that deep, raving melancholy, and so sad a place, I'll comment on that in a moment, combined with the strange stories and pictures he found there of St. Bruno, the father patriarch of that order, suggested that such strange and hideous thoughts and such distracting doubts of some of the fundamentals of Christianity, that he even contemplated suicide. Now this is the abbey as we see it today, in the upper, in 3 of the 4 images. Most of us would probably respond very differently to this place than Boyle did. We tend to find beauty in the mountains today. But that's a more modern sentiment, mostly 18th century and 19th century and subsequently. In the 17th century, it was much more typical for people to find mountains depressing. And that was when I learned this, I was really surprised by that. But that was the case. And Boyle himself was depressed, and probably because of the location of this abbey. Now, if you look in the lower right from this engraving from the 19th century, it gives you more of the kind of, perhaps a darker picture of how things may have appeared to someone, even though in the 19th century this was viewed as a very romantic site. But Boyle, the youthful Boyle, actually did indeed contemplate suicide. And only, as he says, the forbiddenness of self-dispatch prevented him from taking that fatal step. But after a tedious languishment of many months in this tedious perplexity, he wrote, at last it pleased God one day he'd received the sacrament to restore unto him the withdrawn sense of his favor.
What was his age at this stage?
Well, he would have been at the Abbey when he was in his early adolescent years. And then he wrote about it 6 or 7 years later. But Boyle has a number of things that he'll drop into various works of his concerning doubt. And in one of them, he says this. In his autobiography, he does say, those impious suggestions, that is, the doubt that he has, he views those impious suggestions rather as temptations to be suppressed than doubts to be resolved. Yet never after did these fleeting clouds cease now and then to darken the clearest serenity of his quiet. Of my own private and generally unheeded doubts, he wrote a few years later, I could exhibit no short catalog. Now, religious doubt remained a defining characteristic of Boyle's personality. Many of his mature works, I would argue, can be seen as parts of a lifelong conversation with his own soul. And the quality of his thoughts in most of those works shows that doubt played a positive role in the construction of his faith. If I have any original point in this essay, it might be that. His approach to doubt, the other side of the coin, was frankly precocious. Not long after his 20th birthday, he wrote what you see here. He whose faith never doubted may justly doubt of his faith. And immediately before this, he had written what you see next. The dialect of faith runs much upon the first person. For true faith speaks always in the first person. Boyle understood, both intuitively and cognitively, a crucial fact about religious faith. It is a highly personal matter, and only those who take steps to examine their own beliefs can really lay claim to them and live accordingly. His love for God found direct expression in his love for his fellow human beings, starting with the tenants of his estate at Stallbridge, which was an estate that he was inherited from his father, roughly a square mile of land, near the present-day village of Templecombe, on the border between Dorset and Somerset. There were annual cash gifts to the poor on the estate. On occasions, money would accompany medicines that Boyle had made in his own laboratory for sick paupers on his estate. Later, Gilbert Burnet wrote this, and Gilbert Burnet knew him really well. He was Boyle's confessor, really, in his latter part of his life. His charity to those that were in want was so very extraordinary, and so many did partake of them, that I may spend little time on this article. The context here is he was addressing a crowd of thousands at Boyle's funeral. And he knows, many in the crowd know this. Great sums went easily from him, without the partialities of sect, country, or relations. For he considered himself as part of the human nature, as a debtor to the whole race of men. Burnet really knew whereof he spoke. He had served often as an intermediary in Boyle's giving, helping to keep Boyle's identity secret. The donations he could vouch for sometimes exceeded £1,000 a year, which was a very significant sum at the time. He also supported expensive projects to translate the Bible into Welsh, Irish, Turkish, Malayan, and the language of the Indians in Massachusetts, specifically John Eliot's Bible. Robert Boyle supported John Eliot's Bible. Charity is equally seen in Boyle's attitude toward individual persons in ordinary discourse. As Burnet said, when he differed from any, he expressed himself in so humble and so obliging a way that he never treated things or persons with neglect. And I never heard that he offended any one person in his whole life by any part of his deportment. Boyle's approach to intellectual opponents was identical, going out of his way on several occasions to treat their positions fairly and their persons graciously, avoiding gratuitous ad hominem comments, which you find all over the place in 17th century natural philosophy. I love to speak of persons with civility, he said, though of things with freedom. I think such a quarrelsome and injurious way of writing does very much misbecome both a philosopher and a Christian. Overall, Boyle left a truly remarkable legacy on that score. Although he was constantly in the public eye, often writing on controversial topics and speaking with a wide range of people, he seems to have had no real enemies, with the sole exception of philosopher Thomas Hobbes, a truly disagreeable man who had few friends and managed to alienate many English thinkers of the time. Boyle exhibited a similar charity in matters of conscience, proving more ecumenical than many of his countrymen. Although he always supported the established church, he was, as his rector at Stalbridge noted, he was for moderation to those who dissented from us, and not to force tender consciences, for which he seemed to express great averseness. According again to Burnet, he had a most peculiar zeal against all severities and prosecutions upon the count of religion. I have seldom observed him to speak with more heat and indignation than when that came in his way. He not only considered religious persecution immoral, that was the word that Burnet used to describe Boyle's view, he also disliked religious disputes among various Christian sects. Now, the ecumenical attitude evident here and elsewhere has long made me suspicious of several scholarly works that present Boyle as an anti-Catholic writer. This conclusion has mainly been based on the assumption, widely accepted until recently, that Boyle wrote an anonymous, controversialist tract, which you see here. This is one of the copies in the Bodleian Library. It's published in 1687 for the first edition, and there's another edition a couple of years later with a slightly different title. And reasons why a Protestant should not turn papist. Proposed in a letter to a Romish priest, that's the form in which it takes, by a person of quality. Okay? Now, I should tell you that most of Boyle's theological works, many of them, certainly many of them, were written pseudonymously. They were either written under transparent pseudonyms, such as R.B., or under less transparent pseudonyms, such as by a person of honor or by a person of quality, this type of phrase. I won't go into why Boyle was doing that. I can come back to that later if you want me to, after the talk. But this particular work has long been attributed to Robert Boyle, even though most commentators have acknowledged that it's not his stylistically, not at all. But they've assumed that he wrote it. And in this particular copy from the Bodleian, I'm going to magnify this part for you. Mr. Boyle's name was written in a fairly early hand. But upon deeper investigation several years ago, I discovered that he did not write it. I never believed he had. I was always looking out for who probably had, who might have done it. And to make a long story short, the real author turns out to have been a Scottish physician named David Abercrombie, who was from a Catholic family and himself had been a Jesuit priest. He even taught theology at Douai and wrote anti-Protestant tracts in the 1670s. Then had a conversion like Luther's to Protestantism because he had doubts about his salvation. And he had conversion to Protestantism in the 1680s and then wrote anti-Catholic tracts. And he worked for Boyle as a translator in the 1680s. He translated 4 of Boyle's medical works into Latin, or medical and natural philosophical works generally, including the most famous book of all, The Notion of Nature. He's the translator of that one. Now, so far, I've not gotten around to talking about Boyle's science, as you've probably noticed. And I'm really not going to say very much about it. What I'm going to do is skip through several slides pretty quickly and get to the points I want to make further analytically about the science. These images all come from Robert Boyle's books. He's, of course, most famous for his work on air pumps and air pressure. But now, why did Boyle become a scientist? On this point, I want to stress something here, and that is that why does anyone become a scientist? Well, obviously, because we find it interesting, right? We find the study of nature interesting. Without that, it's hard to see how a person could be a good scientist. On the other hand, as soon as he shows an interest in this, and this is again when he's around 20 that this begins to appear, but it begins to appear very seriously when he's about in his 23rd year. And at that point, he develops a continuous period of experimentation that never ceases up to for the rest of his life. And from that very point on, he immediately sees his work as having 2 pieces of larger significance. They're not separated from the science at all. In fact, in the very letter in which he describes his joy in the laboratory, when he finally has a furnace that works, and he's got his experiments going, he writes a letter to Catherine Ranelagh in which he details he's rapturous in this letter about how happy he is that he's got this all going. And in the very same letter, he alludes to a work he has in progress that becomes later his longest book on the usefulness of natural philosophy. This was the first book on science he ever wrote, even though it was not published again for many years later. He did this long before he was working with air pumps. He wrote a book that became a massive work in the 1660s, published in Oxford in 2 different pieces. And it amounts to about 9% of his published work, all told, when you take all of it together. And the general title is The Usefulness of Natural Philosophy. And in the early versions of this, what Boyle says is that nature is the 3rd great divine book in the human library, the other 2 being conscience and scripture. And he expresses this sentiment right at the start of his scientific investigations. Also, very early on, he has a strong desire, like Francis Bacon had, to use our knowledge of nature to improve the human condition. These are uppermost in his work. Now, in the 1650s, Boyle moves to Oxford from his estate in southwestern England. And he rents a room from an apothecary on the high street. The house is no longer standing. This is a 19th century print of where it was. And today, it's marked by this plaque, which many of you may have seen. He hired a young student from Oxford, Robert Hooke, to make apparatus for him and help be his laboratory assistant. Later, Hooke became, on Boyle's recommendation, the experimenter at the Royal Society. And of course, you've all heard of him. He went on to be a great natural philosopher in his own right. Boyle was blessed with having a number of gifted laboratory assistants. One of the byproducts of this work was the 2nd edition of his book on the spring of the air, which contains, rather a sequel really to his book on the spring of the air, which contains the first statement of what we now call Boyle's law, the generalization about pressure and volume. He was interested in the mercury barometer. In fact, he invented the name barometer. He was interested in falling objects in a vacuum. He did the famous experiment of putting a watch inside of a bell jar and evacuating the air as the watch is ringing. Put an alarm watch, a watch with an alarm on it, as he says, inside the bell jar, and did that experiment. Many, many others. But the ones I want to talk about now, that much attention has been given to recently, are shown in the lower right-hand corner in this plate, right here. This is a later air pump. This one wasn't built for him by Robert Hooke. That he used in his second main edition of the Spring of the Air. And inside this receiver, as he would have called it at the time, you see, difficult to make out, there's actually a kitten in there. And Boyle did numerous experiments with live animals, small mammals as well as insects. And the point of this was really to find out, well, of course, what was going on physiologically with these creatures inside low vacuum situations and under heavy pressure, the reverse. And in different kinds of atmospheres, if you evacuated what we would today call the oxygen by allowing a candle to burn it out, for example, and then putting an animal inside, what would happen? Could a butterfly fly inside of a bell jar if you took out the air? And the answer was no. But it lived, whereas small animals did not. Small mammals did not, and birds did not. Now this became the basis for the famous painting by Joseph Wright of Derby in the 18th century, an experiment with an air pump. I'm convinced this is based directly on a passage in Boyle's first book about the air pump, which he talks about doing an experiment in the presence of witnesses, and some of the women turn their faces aside and withdraw from the room. I think it's exactly what's going on in Joseph Wright of Derby's painting. The issue of animal experimentation calls for more comment. The mechanical philosophy, especially as it was articulated by René Descartes, had a darker side. Animals were typically seen as little or nothing more than complex machines, with full rationality and sensitivity reserved only for humans and God. When coupled with a nearly universal desire to improve the human condition by advancing the knowledge of anatomy and physiology, the temptation to engage in animal experimentation was often too great to resist. Boyle, who sought as much as anyone else to enhance what he called the empire of man over inferior creatures, carried out numerous diverse experiments involving both vertebrate and invertebrate live animals: dogs, cats, birds, butterflies, worms, and many others. Yet he did so with considerable sympathy and even regret. On some occasions, he even released animals that had survived one experiment precisely in order to spare them further suffering. Unlike Descartes, Boyle was not convinced that animals lack sensation, and he considered gratuitous cruelty to animals actually to be blasphemous, since all creatures belong to God. On the other hand, he also believed that God intended the creatures to serve humankind, thus sanctioning a certain amount of animal experimentation. Now, there are other features of Boyle's science that I'm just going to skip completely. And I want to turn now to his work on philosophy of science very briefly. He wrote a lot about the process of science and good scientific reasoning. Here he has much in common with Galileo, but without the abstract mathematics. Proper scientific explanations, for example, ought to have at least 4 characteristics. They ought to be suited to particular phenomena. They ought to declare what causes a thing and how it does so. They ought to tell us the means and process that produce an effect. And they ought to focus on means, not agency. Let me develop this briefly by quoting from his critique of Aristotelian forms and qualities. These were immaterial concepts that were said to explain how physical properties of bodies were produced. For example, why does snow dazzle the eyes more than grass does? To say, says Boyle, to say that these and the like effects are performed by the substantial forms of the respective bodies is at best but to tell me what the agent is, not how the effect is wrought, and seems to me but such a kind of general way of answering as leaves the curious inquirer as much to seek for the causes and manner of particular things, as men commonly are for the particular causes of the several strange things performed by witchcraft, though they be told that 'tis some devil that does them all. Indeed, sometimes the devil is in the details. Well, as we've just seen, Boyle advocated a certain approach to nature called the mechanical philosophy, a term he did not actually coin himself, but he was one of the first to use it. The mechanical philosophy, as Boyle understood it, was simply the effort to explain natural phenomena in terms of the purely mechanical properties and powers given to unintelligent matter by God at the creation. And one of his most important books about this was a subtle treatise on the idea of nature, a free inquiry into the vulgarly received notion of nature. Here the term vulgarly received really means the prevailing or commonplace concept of nature from Aristotle and Galen. Adherents of this view tended to personify nature, saying, for example, that nature abhors a vacuum, or nature does nothing in vain. Boyle rejected this for both scientific and theological reasons. We really can't separate these aspects of his thought. They often went hand in hand. Specifically, Boyle thought the Aristotelian view was shallow, making it easy to explain certain phenomena in general terms, but impossible to explain them in terms of particular causes, as in the example I just cited. Thus, it did not produce useful knowledge. Theologically, Boyle considered the Aristotelian view actually idolatrous, since it effectively placed an intelligent, purposive agent, much like a kind of goddess, he says, between God and the world that God had made. He went on to note that the Hebrew Bible contains no word that properly signifies nature in the sense we take it in. Of course, the word nature comes from a Roman word, which is a Roman equivalent of the Greek word physis, a sort of self-existing autonomous thing. Boyle argued for the theological superiority of the mechanical philosophy over this older view. Only such an approach, he believed, would underscore the sovereignty of God and locate purposive activity where it properly belongs, in the mind of the Creator, not in some imaginary nature. Now here I'm going to have to skip some comments on that. I can come back to the mechanical philosophy more if you like. But to wrap up, let me turn to his interest in natural theology. In keeping with his view that the mechanical philosophy was a powerful ally for religion, Boyle was an outspoken advocate of the design argument. Indeed, he had a very strong interest in apologetics generally, reflecting the lifelong conversation he had with his own religious doubts. He wrote extensively on apologetic themes, and in his will, he established a lectureship for proving the Christian religion against notorious infidels, atheists, theists, that is, deists, pagans, Jews, and Mohammedans, not descending lower to any controversies that are among Christians themselves. Now, that idea and that wording may well reflect the intentions of Burnet, actually. This was not written till the very end of Boyle's life, when he was in close conversation with Burnet. But Boyle nevertheless put this in his will. Although he often targeted atheists in his own writings, he uses the term, he realized that general philosophical atheism was rare in his day. He was actually more concerned with what he once called practical atheists, those baptized infidels who lived as if there were no God to judge them. And here, he thought the design argument had its greatest value. He wrote a treatise in parallel with his treatise on the notion of nature. Most of this was written at exactly the same time as the notion of nature was revised and published. And that was in the 1680s. And this one's called A Disquisition about the Final Causes of Natural Things. Final causes really means design or purpose. And his desire here, he says to his readers, what he wants is this. He desires that my reader should not barely observe the wisdom of God, but be in some measure affectively convinced of it. There was no better way, in Boyle's opinion, to give so great a wonder and veneration for it than by knowing and considering the admirable contrivance of the particular productions of that immense wisdom, by which he mainly meant the exquisitely fashioned parts of animals, both great and small. Thereby, Boyle believed, men may be brought upon the same account, both to acknowledge God, to admire him, and to thank him. Those are his italics. A pious and humble man, Boyle always sought to cultivate the same attitude in others. In his last major work, The Christian Virtuoso, here the word virtuoso is synonymous with the modern word scientist. The early Royal Society members called themselves the virtuosi. Boyle further joined religion and science, linking the character of the virtuoso with the actual practice of science. The virtuoso, said Boyle, was to be known for the following traits: a reliance on the visible testimony of nature, not human opinion; placing the pursuit of truth over personal gain, and openness and generosity over secrecy. A piece of advice that Boyle himself violated when it came to alchemy. I can talk about that afterward if you like. But above all, the Christian virtuoso has what he called a great and ingenious modesty of mind. He especially stressed the cultivation of humility. There's a whole section on humility in the Christian virtuoso, since he says the higher degree of knowledge that the scientist attains seems more likely to puff him up than to make him humble. Whether this accurately describes the situation in science today, I leave for others to determine. Robert Boyle died in his sister's house shortly after midnight on the final day of 1691, at least as reckoned here in England. She had died herself just 8 days before, and it's probably true that grief hastened his passing, although he was never robust, and he'd been in declining health for several years. Laid to rest close to her in the chancel of their parish church, the old St. Martin in the Fields, which was replaced by this one in the 1720s. The precise location of his grave is no longer known. The humility suggested by this fate is entirely fitting to the character of one of the greatest scientists who has ever lived. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted. And we've got time for a few questions, so who wants to go? Perhaps I could start actually with one where I get thrown out sometimes when I'm giving general talks on the sort of history of science. I mean, some people think, okay, so Boyle was extremely pious and so forth, and this was sort of a characteristic of the age in which he lived, and therefore you could only get scientific beliefs validated if they were validated by sort of social, by religiously inspired sort of social validation. I mean, that's the sort of way it's put. So therefore, this was a general characteristic of that age, to be pious, and therefore Boyle was simply a character, kind of one example of many from that age. Because could you reflect on that sort of comment? Because it's one that I hear quite a bit. So.
Yeah, let me see if I can locate something I'd like to read to respond to this from the article version. Yeah. Many of you will recognize the name of Stephen Shapin, one of the leading historians of early modern science and a leading sociologist of science. Steve has admitted in his various writings and in presentations he's done on Boyle, he's not really sympathetic with Robert Boyle, with the kind of character Boyle is. He describes Boyle as a gentleman, a scholar, and a Christian. And Steve said, and I am none of these, is what Steve has said about himself, sort of humorously. But Steve's book, The Social History of Truth, which looks at aspects of Boyle's life in light of the 17th century milieu pretty strongly, makes this very point. He says, the serious and systematic embrace of a reflectively religious life was relatively rare for someone of Boyle's condition and degree. Boyle actually lived in a licentious age. 1660, the Restoration, with Charles II and all of that. A sister mother-in-law who's a mistress to Charles II, and whose brother, Elizabeth Black Betty, her brother was the owner of the theater in Drury Lane. He's in this really licentious culture, and he's rejecting it completely. That's quite unusual for someone from his upbringing to have as strong a response to that as he did. So I would suggest that the image of the age as being a great age of piety is pretty badly mistaken. There were many things that the Puritans and Boyle held in common on this score, and that is that they were rejecting the society they saw around them. So he was not alone, of course, in doing that, but he was relatively rare, as Steve says, for someone from his background to do this.
Yes.
It's interesting your point about Boyle wanting to do something that would benefit society, and that his work would be directed in that way. And then you speak of his humility, but then there's a suggestion you're saying that he did rather well out of alchemy.
Yeah, the alchemy situation is different. I don't mean to suggest that he made money out of alchemy, if that's what your question is asking about. No, he did not. He didn't market any of his ideas in a commercial way at all, except insofar as he sold books that he had written. And he was, like anyone else would be, anxious about people who might pirate those books. There was a lot of pirating of books going on in the 17th century. Most of Boyle's books were reprinted in Latin editions that were not authorized on the continent within just a few years of their appearing in England. And he was worried about that and other kinds of things, people taking ideas that he'd published and claiming they were theirs. So intellectual property was a developing idea in his day, and that concern he had. But what I meant by the alchemy piece would be this. Let me respond to that by reading again just a brief part of this essay version. I was commenting at that point on his belief stated in the Christian Virtuoso, that the virtuoso ought to place the pursuit of truth over personal gain and sensual pleasure, openness and generosity over secrecy. So that point. And here's what I said there. Here we must frankly imitate Boyle's usual honesty to his own full. Although much of what he did is consistent with these norms, he nevertheless carefully guarded the various alchemical secrets that he acquired, sometimes for a price, even to the extent of encoding alchemical terms to ensure that his assistants would not be able to pass on the secrets. Now, of course, that's standard practice for people working in the alchemical tradition. And this would have included Isaac Newton and John Locke, among others, among his contemporaries. Locke was a very close friend of Boyle's. In fact, he was one of Boyle's executors. He also sometimes claimed as his own processes he had learned from others, especially processes that he had learned from the American alchemist George Starkey. George Starkey was born in the Bahamas and educated at Harvard. And he came to England in the 1650s, and Boyle learned a lot from him. We've only, in recent years, appreciated how much that took place. To be fair, alchemy was always considered a highly secretive enterprise, and alchemists unashamedly borrowed liberally from one another without acknowledgement. Yet not many years afterward, Boyle himself began self-consciously and somewhat self-righteously to insist on the importance of intellectual property, and his own usual practice at the height of his career was carefully to cite his sources. Now, William Newman and Lawrence Principe are the two principal scholars on Boyle's alchemy, also on Newton's alchemy, and they've suggested plausibly that, quote, the dissonance between Boyle's words on intellectual property and his actions in regard to his chemical forebears, unquote, can be explained by the fact that Boyle, quote, wished to deploy chemistry in the service of natural philosophy and to free it from its ambiguous reputation, emphasizing that this was a fresh start for chemistry. In this regard, linking himself publicly to pre-existing traditions would be counterproductive, unquote. Well, whatever the reason, apart from his extensive involvement with the alchemical tradition, Boyle does seem to have honored religiously his own standard of openness and honesty in scientific communication. His very first paper was, before he published any of his books, an essay of his was published in a collection dedicated to Samuel Hartlib in the mid-1650s. It's called, let me get the exact title here. I think I have the title in here. I do somewhere, I'm not finding it easily. It's words to the effect of on the openness of communication of receipts of medicine, if you will, pharmaceutical formulas. So Boyle is concerned through his whole life with making effective medical remedies available throughout the countryside, especially to the poor. And he publishes his own set of chemical remedies near the end of his life, something which John Wesley did for identical reasons 100 years later. So, you know, there's a bit of ambivalence there about the alchemy, but he's working there in a tradition that's got ambivalence everywhere you step.
Good, so intellectual property is, nothing new under the sun. So I think we better stop there, it's 2:05. So I think we want to thank Ted again for a very interesting little thinking.